The sun was setting over JFK International Airport, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple. Among the rush of travelers hurrying to their gates, a woman in her early 40s walked confidently through the terminal, pulling a sleek carry-on bag behind her. As the CEO of Skyline Airways, she had made it a personal mission to regularly experience her airline's service just like any other passenger would. Today, she had deliberately chosen to dress casually in a comfortable navy blazer, white t-shirt, and jeans. Her natural hair was styled simply, and she wore minimal makeup after a long day of back-to-back meetings. No one would guess that this woman owned the very airline they were about to board. That was exactly how she wanted it. The past 3 years since acquiring Skyline Airways had been transformative. She'd modernized the fleet, improved on-time performance, and revolutionized the airline's digital booking system. But something felt missing. Customer satisfaction scores were good but not great, and she'd been receiving mixed feedback about the in-flight experience. That's why these mystery shopping trips were so important to her. As she approached Gate B7, she noticed the usual pre-boarding buzz. Business travelers typed furiously on their laptops, families tried to keep their children entertained, and flight attendants prepared for boarding. The large windows offered a perfect view of the magnificent Skyline Airways jet, its distinctive blue and silver livery gleaming under the airport lights. She couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. From the age of 7, when her grandmother first took her to watch planes take off at their local airport, she had dreamed of working in aviation. Now, she not only worked in the industry but owned one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country. It was a reality that sometimes still felt surreal. Checking her phone, she saw several missed calls from her executive team. There was an ongoing negotiation about expanding routes to Southeast Asia, and her input was needed. But tonight, she had other priorities. She wanted to experience firsthand how her staff treated regular passengers, especially during the evening rush hour when everyone was tired and stress levels ran high. She observed the gate area carefully, making mental notes. The digital display board was slightly dim and needed updating. The carpet near the priority boarding lane was showing signs of wear. These were small details, but they mattered. Everything contributed to the passenger experience. The boarding call announcement began to echo through the terminal. Good evening, passengers. Welcome to Skyline Airways Flight 207 to San Francisco. We will now begin our priority boarding for business class passengers and elite members. She reached into her bag for her business class ticket, purchased under her rarely used middle name to maintain anonymity. A group of passengers formed a line, and she took her place among them. The air was filled with the usual pre-flight mixture of excitement and anxiety. A young mother struggling with a baby stroller caught her attention. Without hesitation, she stepped out of line to help, steadying the stroller while the mother folded it. The mother smiled gratefully, and for a moment, they shared a look of understanding. These small acts of kindness were what she wanted her airline to be known for. As she returned to her place in line, she noticed one of the flight attendants watching the business class queue with unusual scrutiny. The attendant's expression shifted subtly as her gaze moved from passenger to passenger, and something about that look made the CEO's instincts tingle. After years in corporate leadership, she had developed a keen sense for when something wasn't quite right. The line moved forward slowly, and she could now read the flight attendant's name tag clearly. She made a mental note of it, not knowing that this small detail would become crucially important in the next few minutes. As she approached the boarding pass checkpoint, she took a deep breath, preparing herself for what should have been a routine scan of her ticket. Little did she know, this regular mystery shopping exercise was about to turn into something much more significant, a moment that would not only test her personal resolve, but would also spark a major transformation in her airline's corporate culture. The next few minutes would reveal an uncomfortable truth about biases that still existed within her organization, despite all the progress they thought they'd made. The moment the CEO stepped forward to present her boarding pass, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a crisp uniform, glanced at the business class ticket, then back at her with poorly disguised skepticism. The look in her eyes spoke volumes before she even opened her mouth. "I think there must be some mistake," the flight attendant said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. She held the boarding pass at arm's length, as if it might be counterfeit. "This is the business class line." She emphasized each word slowly, as if speaking to someone who might not understand English well. Several passengers behind the CEO shifted uncomfortably. A businessman in an expensive suit cleared his throat awkwardly, while a young couple exchanged concerned glances. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The CEO maintained her composure, years of boardroom negotiations having taught her the power of staying calm under pressure. "There's no mistake," she replied quietly but firmly, pointing to the seat number on her ticket. "That's my assigned seat." The flight attendant's smile tightened. She made a show of examining the boarding pass more closely, turning it this way and that under the harsh airport lighting. "Well," she said, drawing out the word, "we do have certain standards in business class. I'm sure you understand." Her tone made it clear that she believed the CEO didn't meet these standards. A young man a few spots back in line had already pulled out his phone, discreetly recording the interaction. Others were watching with growing discomfort, some whispering among themselves. The CEO could hear fragments of their conversations. "Is this really happening? In 2025? Someone should say something." "I'd like to see your supervisor," the CEO requested calmly, maintaining eye contact with the flight attendant. She dealt with prejudice before, but seeing it displayed so openly by one of her own employees made her heart heavy. The flight attendant's smile widened, as if this was exactly what she'd been hoping for. "Of course," she replied, reaching for her radio with an exaggerated flourish. "I was just about to suggest that myself." She pressed the button and spoke into it. "Supervisor needed at gate B7. We have a situation with a passenger." While they waited, the flight attendant began allowing other business class passengers to board, pointedly ignoring the CEO, who stepped aside but didn't leave. A well-dressed elderly woman in the line touched the CEO's arm as she passed. "This isn't right, dear," she whispered. "Don't let them get away with this." The CEO nodded gratefully, touched by the small gesture of solidarity. She noticed how the flight attendant had no problem checking the tickets of other business class passengers, regardless of what they were wearing. The disparity was glaring, and she made mental notes of everything she observed. Minutes ticked by slowly. The terminal's usual bustling sounds seemed muffled by the bubble of tension surrounding the gate. More passengers had gathered, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding. Some were openly filming now, their phones held up like silent witnesses to the discrimination playing out before them. The flight attendant kept shooting superior glances in the CEO's direction, clearly expecting her to give up and walk away. Instead, the CEO stood her ground, reviewing work emails on her phone while she waited. She could have easily pulled out her company ID and ended the situation immediately, but something told her to let it play out. This was an opportunity to see exactly how deep the problem ran in her airline. Finally, footsteps approached rapidly from the direction of the terminal. The supervisor was hurrying toward them, already looking apologetic as he took in the scene. Before he could speak, though, the flight attendant jumped in, speaking quickly and loudly. "This passenger claims to have a business class ticket," she announced, emphasizing the word claims in a way that made several nearby passengers wince. "I'm concerned about maintaining our airline's image. You understand how important that is, don't you?" The supervisor, a man who had clearly been in the industry long enough to recognize a potentially volatile situation, tried to take control. "Let me see the ticket, please," he said professionally, extending his hand. But the flight attendant wasn't finished. She launched into a series of thinly veiled racist remarks about maintaining standards and ensuring our premium passengers feel comfortable. Each word she spoke was digging a deeper hole, not just for herself, but for the airline's reputation. The CEO listened carefully, noting how the flight attendant's language cleverly danced around explicit discrimination while making her prejudiced intentions crystal clear. It was the kind of subtle bias that often went unreported but could make traveling a nightmare for passengers of color. The growing crowd of onlookers had become almost entirely silent, creating an eerie bubble of tension in the usually noisy terminal. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how this would play out. Some had their phones trained on the scene, while others looked away in embarrassment or anger. This was more than just a simple boarding pass check now. It had become a moment of truth, not just for the airline, but for everyone watching. How this situation was handled would send a message about what kind of behavior society was willing to tolerate in 2025. The supervisor finally managed to get a look at the boarding pass, and his face showed nothing but confusion. "This ticket appears to be completely in order," he began, but the flight attendant cut him off again. "But surely we need to verify," she started, her voice rising with frustration. She was about to learn a valuable lesson about making assumptions, though she didn't know it yet. The CEO reached for her bag, knowing it was time to end this particular charade. The tension at Gate B7 had reached its peak. The supervisor stood awkwardly between his flight attendant and the CEO, still unaware of who he was really dealing with. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their phones capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. The terminal's usual background noise had faded to a hushed murmur, as if the whole airport was holding its breath. "I need to document this situation," the flight attendant announced, pulling out a company incident report form with an air of authority. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote, but her voice remained loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've had issues with people trying to sneak into business class before. We can't be too careful these days." The CEO watched as the flight attendant's pen moved across the paper, noting how she was trying to twist the situation into something it wasn't. A young girl in the crowd tapped at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, why is that lady being so mean?" The mother quickly shushed her, but the innocent question hung in the air, perfectly capturing the absurdity of the situation. "Ma'am," the supervisor tried again, his professional demeanor cracking slightly under the strain. "The ticket is completely valid. I don't see any reason to." "But look at her," the flight attendant interrupted, gesturing wildly at the CEO's casual attire. "This isn't what our business class represents. What will our other premium passengers think?" Her voice had taken on a slightly hysterical edge, as if she could sense her control of the situation slipping away. An elderly businessman in the crowd spoke up, his voice firm but tired. "The only thing making me uncomfortable right now is your behavior, young lady." Several other passengers nodded in agreement, and someone in the back of the crowd clapped briefly. The flight attendant's face flushed red, but she pressed on, her voice rising higher. "I'm just trying to maintain our airline standards. Our business class passengers expect a certain level of sophistication." She emphasized the last word while giving the CEO another dismissive look. The supervisor's face had grown increasingly pale as he watched his colleague dig herself deeper into trouble. He tried to intervene once more. "I really think we should." But the flight attendant was on a roll now, her words tumbling out faster and more recklessly. "We have a responsibility to our high-paying customers. We can't just let anyone walk in here with a ticket they probably—" She caught herself before finishing the sentence, but everyone knew what she had been about to imply. A woman in a business suit stepped out of the line, her face tight with anger. "I'm a frequent flyer with this airline, and I can tell you that the only person damaging its reputation right now is you." More passengers joined in with murmurs of agreement. The CEO remained calm through all of this, observing every detail. She watched how other staff members nearby shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. She noted how some passengers were openly recording the incident, while others looked away in embarrassment. Every reaction, every silent witness, told her something important about how discrimination played out in real time. The flight attendant, sensing she was losing support, tried a different approach. Her voice suddenly became sugary sweet again. "Look, I'm sure we can find you a nice seat in economy. Maybe next time you can book in advance when there's a sale." The patronizing tone was the last straw for many onlookers. A wave of disapproving murmurs swept through the crowd. Someone in the back shouted, "This is shameful." Another voice added, "It's 2025, not 1950. The supervisor, looking increasingly distressed, finally found his voice. "Please, let's take this somewhere more private." "No," the CEO said quietly but firmly, speaking up for the first time in several minutes. "This shouldn't be private. This needs to be seen." Her calm voice cut through the tension like a knife. "What's happening here is exactly what hundreds of passengers face every day on airlines around the world. The only difference is that most of them don't own the airline." The flight attendant's smug expression froze. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" The CEO maintained direct eye contact with her as she reached into her bag. The supervisor's eyes widened as he began to realize what was happening. The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing that something big was about to happen. "I've been watching and listening carefully," the CEO continued, her voice clear and steady. "I've seen how you treated other passengers differently. I've heard every carefully worded implication, and I've witnessed how you tried to mask discrimination behind company policy." The flight attendant's face had begun to lose its color. Her hands, still clutching the incident report, started to tremble more visibly. The supervisor looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. A small group of airline employees had gathered at the edges of the crowd, whispering among themselves. One of them appeared to recognize the CEO, and a ripple of realization began to spread through the group. The terminal seemed to grow even quieter, if that was possible. The only sounds were the distant announcements over the PA system and the soft beeping of the gate equipment. Everyone waited to see what would happen next, knowing they were witnessing something significant. The CEO took one last look around the gate area, taking in every face, every reaction, every phone still recording. This moment would change things, not just for this flight attendant or this airline, but hopefully for the industry as a whole. She reached into her bag one final time, ready to reveal her identity and bring this incident to its inevitable conclusion. Time seemed to slow down as the CEO pulled out her company identification card. The glossy badge caught the fluorescent airport lighting, its official logo gleaming. She held it up without fanfare, letting the reality of the situation sink in naturally. "I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Skyline Airways," she stated simply, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent gate area. The effect was immediate and electric. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by scattered whispers and the rapid clicking of phone cameras. The flight attendant's face went through a remarkable series of transformations, from confusion to disbelief, then to horror as recognition finally dawned. The incident report form she'd been holding so proudly moments before slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. I. The flight attendant stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating instantly. She looked desperately at her supervisor, who appeared equally shocked. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. A young passenger in the crowd couldn't contain their excitement. "Oh snap," they exclaimed, their voice carrying clearly through the terminal. Several people chuckled, breaking the tension slightly. The moment would later go viral on social media, with millions of views and thousands of supportive comments. The CEO stepped forward, picking up the dropped incident report. She scanned it briefly, her expression remaining professional but firm. "I see you've documented your concerns about maintaining our airline's image," she said, her voice steady. "Let's talk about that image for a moment." She turned to address not just the flight attendant, but everyone gathered around. "The image I want for this airline isn't about what someone wears or how they look. It's about how we treat people. Every single person who walks through these gates deserves respect." Several passengers nodded in agreement. A few even applauded quietly. The CEO continued, her words carrying the weight of someone who had experienced discrimination firsthand throughout her career. "I travel like this regularly, without announcing who I am, because I want to see the real experience our passengers have. Most of our staff are exceptional." She glanced meaningfully at the supervisor, who had at least tried to handle the situation properly. "But clearly we still have work to do." The flight attendant had begun to cry silently, mascara tracking down her cheeks. Her perfectly maintained appearance was crumbling along with her composure. I never meant." She tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. An older flight attendant stepped forward from the growing group of airline staff who had gathered. Her gray hair was neatly tucked under her uniform cap, and her eyes held years of experience. "Ma'am," she addressed the CEO, "on behalf of the crew, I want to apologize. This isn't what we stand for." The CEO acknowledged her with a nod. "I know it isn't. That's exactly why this moment is so important." She turned back to the distraught flight attendant. "What happened here today isn't just about you or me. It's about every passenger who has ever felt unwelcome or uncomfortable because of someone's assumptions." By now, word had spread through the terminal. More people were gathering at the edges of the crowd, phones raised to capture the moment. Airport staff stood watching, their usual duties temporarily forgotten in the face of this extraordinary scene. A well-dressed businessman who had been waiting to board stepped forward. "I've been flying business class with this airline for 15 years, he announced, "and I can tell you that the only thing making me uncomfortable right now is the treatment I just witnessed." The CEO smiled gratefully at him before addressing the gathered crowd again. "Change doesn't happen in boardrooms," she said. "It happens in moments like this, when we confront our biases and choose to do better." She pulled out her phone and quickly dialed a number. "Please send someone from HR to Gate B7, she said quietly into the phone. "And we'll need to arrange for a replacement flight attendant for this flight." The flight attendant's shoulders slumped as the reality of her situation sank in. The supervisor finally found his voice. "I'll handle the immediate arrangements," he said professionally, though his voice shook slightly. As if on cue, the boarding gate computer chimed, displaying a message about a slight delay in boarding. Nobody complained. The usual frustration that accompanied flight delays was notably absent as passengers recognized they were witnessing something more important than an on-time departure. The CEO turned to the young mother she had helped earlier with the stroller. "Would you mind if I sat next to you in business class? I'd love to hear about your experience with our airline." The mother smiled warmly, bouncing her baby gently in her arms. "It would be an honor," she replied. "And I have quite a few suggestions if you're interested in hearing them." "That's exactly what I'm interested in hearing," the CEO responded with a genuine smile. She turned back to address the gate area one final time. "Boarding will resume in a few minutes. Thank you all for your patience. And thank you for showing that most people will stand up against discrimination when they see it." As the crowd began to disperse and normal airport activities resumed, the CEO knew this was just the beginning. What happened here today would lead to real changes, not just in policies and procedures, but in the everyday interactions that made up the true heart of her airline. The incident at Gate B7 spread across social media like wildfire. By the time the flight landed in San Francisco, the video had already gained millions of views. Comments poured in from around the world, with people sharing their own experiences of discrimination during air travel. What started as an unfortunate confrontation was quickly becoming a catalyst for industry-wide change. The CEO spent most of the 6-hour flight writing notes on her tablet, occasionally pausing to chat with fellow passengers who shared their stories and suggestions. The young mother sitting next to her turned out to be a diversity consultant for tech companies, and their conversation sparked several ideas that would later become cornerstone policies. Back at the airline's headquarters, things moved quickly. The CEO called an emergency board meeting for the following morning. The boardroom, usually filled with discussions about profit margins and route expansions, now echoed with passionate debates about corporate culture and social responsibility. "We're not just going to issue a standard apology and move on," the CEO announced to her executive team. "This is our wake-up call. We're going to use this moment to create real, lasting change." She rolled up her sleeves and walked to the whiteboard, ready to outline her vision. The changes started immediately. Within a week, the airline launched a comprehensive review of its hiring practices. The Human Resources Department, working overtime, began developing new training programs that went far beyond the usual corporate diversity seminars. "We need something different," the CEO insisted during a planning meeting, "not just PowerPoint presentations and handouts. We need our staff to understand how it feels to be on the receiving end of prejudice." She shared her own experience from that night, using it as a teaching tool rather than a source of shame. The airline partnered with civil rights organizations and diversity experts to create immersive training sessions. Flight attendants and ground staff participated in role-playing scenarios that put them in their passengers' shoes. The exercises were uncomfortable at times, but that was exactly the point. One flight attendant, after completing the new training, approached the CEO with tears in her eyes. "I never realized," she admitted. "Sometimes we're so focused on rules and procedures that we forget we're dealing with real people with real feelings." The changes weren't just internal. The airline revamped its customer feedback system, making it easier for passengers to report discriminatory behavior. They installed tablets at gates and in lounges where customers could quickly share their experiences. More importantly, they created a dedicated team to review and act on these reports. The CEO herself set an example by continuing to take regular flights incognito, sometimes in economy, sometimes in business class. She would sit quietly, observing and taking notes, occasionally revealing her identity when she witnessed either particularly good or concerning behavior. During one such flight, she watched as a flight attendant went out of her way to help an elderly passenger who spoke limited English. The CEO later called that attendant to her office not for discipline, but to learn from her natural empathy and customer service skills. Social media played a crucial role in the transformation. The airline's communications team shared regular updates about their progress, not just through corporate statements, but through real stories from staff and passengers. They weren't afraid to acknowledge mistakes or share lessons learned. The training videos they created featured actual employees sharing their experiences and insights. "I used to make assumptions without realizing it," one ground staff member admitted on camera. "Now I catch myself and remember that every passenger deserves the same respect." 3 months after the incident, the airline introduced a groundbreaking policy. Any employee who reported or intervened to stop discriminatory behavior would receive recognition and rewards. It was their way of encouraging staff to be active allies rather than silent bystanders. The CEO made sure the changes weren't just cosmetic. She allocated significant resources to support the new initiatives. When some shareholders questioned the expense, she stood firm. "This isn't just about doing the right thing," she explained. "It's about building a better, stronger airline that truly serves all our passengers." The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some longtime employees resisted the changes, claiming they were unnecessary. Others worried about being accused of discrimination for enforcing legitimate policies. The CEO addressed these concerns head-on in town hall meetings and one-on-one conversations. "We're not asking you to stop doing your jobs," she would explain. "We're asking you to do them with more awareness and empathy. There's a difference between enforcing rules and making assumptions based on how someone looks." 6 months into the changes, the results were becoming clear. Customer satisfaction scores were rising. Employee morale improved as staff felt empowered to provide better service to all passengers. The airline started winning awards for its innovative approach to corporate culture change. But perhaps the most meaningful feedback came from the passengers themselves. Letters and emails poured in daily, sharing stories of positive experiences and noting the visible change in how they were treated. The airline's social media pages, once filled with complaints, now featured countless messages of appreciation. The CEO kept the original incident report from that night at Gate B7, framed on her office wall. It served as a constant reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come from confronting uncomfortable truths. The airline's story became a case study in how one moment of crisis, handled with wisdom and determination, could transform an entire organization. The story of what happened at Gate B7 wasn't just changing one airline, it was transforming the entire aviation industry. As summer turned to fall, other airlines began reaching out, wanting to learn more about the new training programs and policies that had made such a difference. The flight attendant from the incident, rather than simply being fired, became an unexpected part of the solution. After a lengthy discussion with the CEO, they agreed that her experience could serve a greater purpose. "I want to turn my mistake into something positive," she said, her voice shaking but determined during a staff meeting. She began speaking at airline industry conferences, sharing her story with brutal honesty. "I thought I was just doing my job," she would tell the audience. "But I was really just hiding my prejudices behind company policies. It took losing my position to make me see the truth." The CEO made sure her story wasn't just about punishment, but about growth and learning. Together, they developed a powerful presentation that showed how unconscious bias could affect anyone and how important it was to recognize and address it. At one industry event, a veteran pilot stood up after their presentation. "I've been flying for 30 years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I've seen this kind of thing happen countless times. But this is the first time I've seen someone brave enough to admit their mistakes and try to help others learn from them." The airline's training program became so successful that they decided to share it freely with other carriers. The CEO believed that improving the industry as a whole was more important than maintaining a competitive advantage. "We're not just in the business of flying planes," she often said. We're in the business of connecting people. They created online modules that any airline could use, featuring real stories from passengers and staff. One particularly powerful video showed a collection of travelers sharing their experiences of being profiled or discriminated against. The simple honesty of their stories touched hearts and opened minds. The changes spread beyond just airlines. Airports began adopting similar training programs for their security staff and retail workers. Ground transportation companies asked for advice on implementing their own diversity initiatives. The ripple effect kept growing. A touching moment came when an elderly couple approached the CEO at an airport. "We saw what happened that night on social media," the woman said. "Our granddaughter showed us the video. We've been flying for 50 years, and we've seen so many people treated badly. Thank you for finally doing something about it." The flight crews noticed big changes too. A flight attendant with 20 years of experience shared her thoughts during a training session. "Before, we were always worried about following rules. Now we focus on treating people right first, then figuring out how to apply the rules fairly." The airline's social media presence transformed completely. Instead of just posting about sales and destinations, they shared stories of positive interactions between staff and passengers. They celebrated moments when their employees went above and beyond to make everyone feel welcome. One post went viral when it showed a young flight attendant learning sign language to better communicate with a deaf passenger. Another touched hearts when it featured a ground crew member who noticed an elderly passenger looking confused and spent his break helping her navigate the terminal. The CEO made sure to recognize and reward these kinds of actions. "This is what real customer service looks like," she would say during staff meetings. "It's not about uniforms or procedures. It's about seeing the human being in front of you." Even the physical spaces began to change. The airline redesigned their lounges and gates to be more welcoming and accessible to all passengers. They added prayer rooms, nursing spaces for mothers, and quiet areas for passengers with sensory sensitivities. Signs appeared in multiple languages, and staff were encouraged to learn basic phrases in different languages. The former flight attendant from the incident completed a degree in diversity and inclusion studies while working with the airline's training department. Her journey from making a terrible mistake to becoming an advocate for change inspired others to examine their own biases and behaviors. During one training session, she shared something profound. "The hardest part wasn't losing my job. It was facing the truth about myself. But once I did that, I could finally start growing as a person." The CEO often reflected on how a difficult moment had turned into such a powerful force for change. During a television interview, she explained, "Sometimes it takes a mirror being held up to see ourselves clearly. That night at the gate was our mirror moment." Other companies beyond the aviation industry began to take notice. Tech firms, retail chains, and hotels sent representatives to learn from the airline's experience. The CEO welcomed them all, believing that positive change in any industry helped create a better world for everyone. A year after the incident, the airline held a special ceremony to launch their new mission statement. Gone were the usual corporate phrases about market leadership and shareholder value. Instead, it simply read, "Connecting hearts and minds across the skies, treating every passenger with dignity and respect." The ceremony wasn't held in a fancy hotel or corporate headquarters. Instead, they gathered at Gate B7, which had become a symbol of transformation. The gate now featured a small plaque that read, "Where change takes flight." It served as a daily reminder to staff and passengers alike that every moment carries the potential for positive change. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, the airline's corporate headquarters was buzzing with excitement. They had just received news that would validate all their hard work. Skyline Airways had won the prestigious Industry Innovation Award for Corporate Culture Reform. The award ceremony was being held in a grand ballroom filled with aviation industry leaders from around the world. As the CEO walked onto the stage to accept the award, she paused to look at the diverse crowd before her. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all united by their commitment to making air travel better for everyone. "A year ago," she began her speech, "I stood in an airport terminal and watched discrimination happen right in front of me. But what could have been just another sad story became something much more powerful. It became a moment of change. The audience listened intently as she shared how that one incident had sparked a revolution in airline culture. She didn't just talk about policies and procedures, she told stories about real people and real changes. She spoke about the young passenger who had written to thank them after experiencing his first flight without being randomly selected for extra screening. About the flight attendant who had learned sign language to better serve deaf passengers. About the ground crew member who had started a support group for employees facing discrimination. But the real success story, she continued, isn't in the awards or recognition. It's in the thousands of small moments that happen every day at airports around the world. Moments where people choose kindness over prejudice, understanding over assumption. As if to prove her point, a video screen behind her came to life, showing clips from security cameras and passenger videos. There was the elderly passenger being patiently helped by a young staff member. A flight attendant calming a nervous child on their first flight. A ground crew member using a translation app to help a lost foreign tourist. The CEO shared how their training program had spread beyond just their airline. Today, over 50 airlines worldwide have adopted our inclusive service standards. More than 200 airports have implemented similar training programs. But numbers don't tell the whole story. She invited the former flight attendant from the Gate B7 incident to join her on stage. The woman who had once shown such prejudice now stood as a symbol of transformation. "I was wrong," she said simply into the microphone. "But being wrong taught me how to be better." The audience gave them both a standing ovation. In that moment, everyone could feel that they were part of something bigger than just an award ceremony. They were witnessing the power of turning a negative moment into positive change. Back at the airline's headquarters, they created a special display case for the award. But instead of putting it in the executive office, they placed it at Gate B7, right next to the "Where Change Takes Flight" plaque. It served as a daily reminder to every passenger and employee who passed through. The CEO made it a tradition to personally work one shift each month at various airport positions: check-in desk, gate agent, baggage service. She wanted to stay connected to the real experiences of both staff and passengers. During one of these shifts, she met an elderly man who recognized her from the viral video. "I've been flying for over 50 years, he told her, his eyes misty. "And for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm treated the same as everyone else. Not because of what I'm wearing or how I look, but just because I'm a person." The story became a case study at business schools around the world. Students analyzed how one moment of crisis had been turned into an opportunity for systemic change. But more importantly, they learned how corporate culture could be transformed through authentic leadership and genuine commitment to change. The airline's success proved that doing the right thing was also good for business. Their customer satisfaction scores reached record highs. Employee retention improved dramatically. They became known as the airline of choice for international travelers, particularly those who had faced discrimination elsewhere. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy was the subtle change in how people treated each other at airports. The tension that often filled terminal buildings began to ease. Passengers started sharing more positive stories on social media. Other companies began asking how they could create similar transformations in their own industries. The CEO kept a photo on her desk from the day of the incident. It showed Gate B7 with its crowd of onlookers, all witnessing a moment that would spark industry-wide change. Next to it sat a more recent photo of the same gate, now a symbol of progress and transformation. During a recent interview, a reporter asked her if she would have done anything differently that night. She thought for a moment before responding, "The only thing I would change is that it needed to happen at all. But since it did happen, I'm grateful we could turn it into something positive." The story continued to inspire others to speak up when they witnessed discrimination. Passengers began sharing their own stories of standing up against prejudice, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the travel industry and beyond. As the CEO looked out her office window at the planes taking off and landing, she reflected on how far they'd come. The incident at Gate B7 hadn't just changed an airline, it had helped change how people saw each other. And in the end, that was the greatest innovation of all.